Rajiv, I want to ask you that expanding consciousness, if we can, for all of us, start with defining what you feel, what is consciousness? Is it the mind? Is it something deeper than that? Is it what we call Atma, the soul? What would you say is consciousness?
Well, that is one of the most difficult questions in philosophy, whether it's Buddhist philosophy or Indian philosophy, and there's a great deal of discussion and debate. And the reason is actually very simple, that when we talk about consciousness, we're talking about something that is beyond a conceptual vocabulary. And so for example, if I can't tell you what Coca-Cola tastes like unless you have tasted it. Can you imagine what it is like trying to communicate what consciousness is? And I certainly haven't experienced myself the many layers of consciousness. But having said that, there are sort of what we call convenient reference points or verbalizations that give us a sort of a taste or a sense of what we mean about consciousness. And as you rightly pointed out, they vary from tradition to tradition. So what I share with you really comes from a Buddhist perspective, and that doesn't mean that our perspective is exclusive and it is absolutely right. And as His Holiness often says, that we evolve these concepts in a form and manner that is most useful for us. So that sort of is the preface. So in our tradition, we sort of, there are, consciousness has 4 layers.
Okay.
And it starts with the grossest layer, which is the brain, the mind that rests or is interconnected with the brain, the physiological brain.
Right.
So the consciousness, the subtle aspects of the mind is what immediately is the byproduct of the brain. Then the second layer that comes in is the layer that responds to our perceptions. So Nietzsche famously said, "I think, therefore I am." Right. So the very fact that the minute we think and we become aware we think is the connection with the physiological brain. And then sort of the next layer is when we move beyond that to our experience, the experience of our sense perceptions. Smell, taste, touch, etc. And then comes the third layer, which is really the repository of the imprints of our sense perceptions, our feelings, our emotions, and they leave their imprint on the third layer of consciousness, which then sort of influences our further behavior and actions. Because even as Western psychiatry tells us that our experiences of our childhood or even adulthood, once we've experienced something, that begins to impact subsequent experiences.
Right.
So the third layer is really sort of the storehouse of all these imprints. And these imprints are not created so much by our actions or our experiences per se, but as I was saying yesterday, the experience of the experience and our motivation behind an action. So there may have been an act of violence, but if the act of violence was with a good motivation, then the imprint in a sense is a positive one.
I call that intent.
Yes, intent.
Yes, yeah.
And then the fourth layer, which somehow maybe is somewhere approaches the idea of Brahman, but not really, and I'll tell you why, is called, from Pali Sanskrit, it's called Manas, which is the larger, I don't even want to say universal, because it sort of then tends to suggest that it exists independently of these 3 layers. Now, what's really important to understand in the Buddhist concept of dependent origination, don't worry about the phrase. As I'd mentioned to you that yesterday I gave the example of ice cream and said coffee ice cream. And so things exist dependent on other causes and conditions. So when the condition changes, there's no ice cream. So in our worldview, unlike the soul in the Christian traditions or Atman or Brahman in the Hindu tradition, what really happens is it's sort of like the melted ice cream. So when the conditions are appropriate and right, then they take form as consciousness. Otherwise, they merely remain as the potential. So just like the elements that make up ice cream have the potential to become ice cream when the causes and conditions are right. So consciousness is only generated when those causes and conditions are appropriate for that. So we don't have the notion of an all-pervading consciousness.
But though you did say that the first 2 or 3 levels are about awareness, sensory awareness.
Well,
you don't call it consciousness as yet.
Well, it is all a part. Basically, we have a wonderful phrase which we call subtle mind.
Right.
So these are the sort of the progressively subtle layers of mind, and for the mind to manifest itself as we understand it, it needs the physiological brain.
Yeah, absolutely.
For it to take that
That's
form.
the way we understand it. Yes.
But in the absence of the physiological brain, it doesn't mean that consciousness
does not
exist.
Exactly.
So long as the causes and conditions exist. And so it can happen that so when someone dies, the mind, the mind becomes increasingly subtle. And if you are enlightened, as it were, so unlike in the Hindu tradition, where the consciousness then merges with Brahman, here the consciousness either just dissolves, or it retains this potential, like the elements of ice cream, looking for an appropriate egg and sperm coming together. And mind you, it need not be only human; it could be animal too. For that consciousness to manifest. And it is the preceding imprints in that consciousness that will help determine, to the degree that it can make the choice as a bodhisattva, as Dalai Lama would make,
right.
Or the proclivity to that would depend on what had preceded it.
So, I wanted to ask you, your journey has taken you through different, I wouldn't say different faiths, but different masters. You started with Thakur first, Aapka.
Sri Ramakrishna.
Ramakrishnan, yes. You also did the yoga thing with B.K.S. Iyengar. And then there have been so many other masters, and then finally it's been Buddhism, right? Was there any conflict in you, or was it like a,
Well, the amazing thing was that actually there were 3 principal strands.
Huh.
The rest was sort of to learn from everybody you meet in some form or the other, because as a struggling aspirant and sadhaka myself, I was very anxious and keen to look at other people's journeys and see what I could learn from it.
Right.
And this was something in which my sort of root teacher, the Dalai Lama, was extremely encouraging. Because as I've shared personally, but just before his audience, that though the Dalai Lama is a preeminent Buddhist monk, when he got the Nobel Peace Prize, I was privileged to be with him, and he came out and he gave me the check, and he said, now we should set up an institution, and wouldn't it be wonderful if the Pope and I and some religious leaders were to go to Mecca together?
Wow.
So it was the audacity of that vision that really demonstrated the extent of his inclusiveness. And so while retaining sort of true to one's journey, we are encouraged to learn from the others.
Okay.
And what was an element of great joy for me was that my first root guru was Swami Ranganathananda of the Ramakrishna Mission. And then later I met His Holiness, and simultaneously I'd already met B.K.S. Iyengar. So at different times, I was privileged both to moderate a conversation between Swamiji and the Dalai Lama, and there is one on YouTube. That predated video recordings.
Okay.
But there's one with B.K.S. Iyengar and the Dalai Lama.
Wow.
And then how the 3 of them in their own ways became extremely good friends. And the ability, and I really want to flag this in these fragmented times when it is, the otherness of the other is constantly being affirmed,
right.
is that there's a young cleric called Salman Chishti at the Dargah in Ajmer Sharif. And he was telling me that when His Holiness visited, this is the shrine of a Sufi saint, 700-800 years ago, who passed away. And when His Holiness prostrated and put his head down, flat out, his forehead touching, the part of the grave where the Khwaja Sahib's feet were. He spent 15, 20 minutes in silence there and woke up and said, look, I have just, experienced divine reality.
Wow.
And this was an agnostic responding to the divine. So it wasn't really that struggle wasn't a conflict at all. And let's not forget that Sri Ramakrishna's principal disciple was Swami Vivekananda, sort of an agnostic,
right,
a disciple of a bhakta. So there are really no contradictions inherently. I mean, there are differences, and they depend again on our different mental dispositions. I mean, that's one of our favorite articulations, that each one of us needs a different mental diet and perhaps different mental diets at different times, just like we eat different foods in summer than we do in winter.
Right. So, I mean, this is interesting, Rajiv. So I want to ask you personally, so would you call yourself a religious person, or are you a spiritual person? Or is there a difference for you?
I have no idea. I mean, I'm just me struggling with trying to soften my sense of self. And I am extremely fearful of labels.
Right,
and
okay.
I did want to again, one of the great risks of our contemporary verbalization of non-conceptual ideas is that they can limit us to what we understand that verbalization to really mean. For example, if you were to ask His Holiness ever about his spiritual experiences, he'd say, what?
He is something else. I mean, the lightness which he takes himself, the joy, I mean, he's just amazing. So, yes.
Well, I mean,
most other godmen are so, I'm a godman. They're so heavy about themselves.
I think it is this aspect that, the willingness to recognize, with deep humility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, and that humility doesn't come as a form of posturing, but really to recognize at any given time how little you know, and to be so deeply conscious of your own imperfections.
Absolutely.
So it isn't that because you've done, I don't know what, a week-long course in meditation, that suddenly you're enlightened or you reach it, or even a lifetime.
Yeah.
And I just share an anecdote that I was, moderating a conversation between His Holiness and Rowan Williams, who was the former Archbishop of Canterbury at Trinity College, Cambridge.
Okay.
And His Holiness used to tell me, I'd go up to him, and I've known him for 40 years, so every few years I'd go up and say, Your Holiness, nothing is happening. And he'd he'd ignore what I was saying, or I'd say, my body shook, or I saw the light, and I mean, he just, so what?
Right.
This went on. And then at one point when I persisted, he said, but what's the hurry? And I said, but it's been 40 years. He said, but it takes eons of lifetimes. And so
Very encouraging.
Exactly. So I narrated the story to the audience. Right. And so His Holiness said, keep quiet. I mean, if you say things like that, no one's going to listen to me. Right. So the point is, it does take time. And it doesn't mean that it's, from 0 to 0.01 in one lifetime. But, to become enlightened, whatever that claim is, I have no idea, is a process. And one of the first learnings is patience. And so the great challenge in these times of instant gratification
right.
is that it is delusional when we suddenly feel that something dramatic has happened, and when the next crisis comes up in our lives, we just collapse, and then we're disappointed at the method in the first place. It's like you couldn't decide tomorrow morning that you wanted to be a great baseball player or an athlete who ran a 2.5-minute mile. Even in something as mundane as that, there is this sort of a Rubicon of 10,000 hours of practice. So we put in a few hours of practice, and suddenly we expect us to walk on air.
Yeah, true. No, I mean, we all acknowledge that we're in times of great polarization, conflict. And I mean, the minute you're from India, the first thing that comes up, people talk about is, the law of karma. So is everything predestined? Where does free will come into it? So what are your thoughts on that, after your practice with the Dalai Lama, cause and effect is something that the Dalai Lama talks about a lot.
Well, actually, causality is not just about what the Dalai Lama says. Causality is a reality that I think science
one of the
confirms.
laws of the universe.
It's one of the laws of physics,
Yeah.
And not even sort of metaphysics in very simple terms. And so how does the idea of karma work? And that's why when I talked about the layer of the mind,
Yeah.
which is the storehouse of the imprints of our thoughts rather than actions. And some of them are voluntary and some of them are involuntary. So the involuntary ones, for example, would be our exposure to, say, what you watch on television, or we may have been witness to war crimes in Ukraine or at Auschwitz in Nazi Germany. And so that will leave certain imprints in our consciousness, which then influence our subsequent emotional and psychological responses. However, that the two things happen. One is that we have in human form, which is something that animals don't have. So animals reflexively live their lives out substantially. Some species of animals, like apes and things, have some element of volition. And dogs, for example, are considered man's best friend because they're most likely to be impacted and influenced by human affection and love, and can still develop a relationship. So as human beings, we have the capacity for volition, so we can, through volition, think thoughts or use plant antidotes into our brain that will neutralize the karmic imprints that cause us. I don't want to say positive or negative because those are qualities we ascribe to them. I was once interviewing a great, well-known spiritual teacher who shall remain unnamed, and who was posturing about his enlightenment, and suggested that, look, because I'm enlightened, I now no longer experience pain. And so I suggested to him, well, I mean, if you were to land on the battlefield of Ukraine, would you not feel pain looking at the pain of others?
Absolutely, yeah.
So, I mean, we cannot anesthetize ourselves to the reality of life around us and say, look, I want to be Superman or Superwoman, and I will have no experience of discomfort or pain whatsoever. And hence this idea comes in of the suffering, of the pain of pain. So we can experience that pain, but we can see it in the context that it happens so that it doesn't throw us off for a long period of time.
So Rajiv, tell us a little more about this, because pain and suffering is something that we're all struggling with, right? So what would you say is your best response when you say, don't aggravate your suffering by suffering the suffering? What exactly do you mean by that?
It means that when I suffer, which means that...
So you have a pain in your back right now, yeah?
So if I have a pain in my back right now, what I try and do, and the operative word is try. I want to make no pretension that when my back hurts, it hurts like hell. and I want to pop a pill to see how I can short-circuit it, and I don't sit back and there are meditation exercises which recommend you visualize your pain and you give it a color, form, and shape, and all that exists. I try to do that, but it is usually not enough, and I need to pop a pill. So to that degree, where there is an instant solution possible, when it gets too much, I take it. But in the larger context, it is sort of, it's okay not to be okay. And let me give you an example that when my mother was dying, and this was the first sort of experience within the family that I had not seen death from such close quarters. And so, I used to see His Holiness a lot, sort of more often than I do now. And so I went and I was just howling, and, all of 40 years old. And so His Holiness let me howl. And then he said that, and I was being very apologetic because I felt a failure that I was weeping because my mother was dying, and I should somehow, as a student of the Dalai Lama, be very sort of evolved and stoic and see, well, I mean, this is the reality, we're all going to die one day. And he said, well, look, I wept when my teacher died. Now, the difference is that I wept for 5 minutes, and it has been 50 minutes that you've been weeping. So for that emotion to come up is entirely legitimate and reasonable. It is just that how we can locate it in the larger perspective of life and the reality of life. And so the underlying principle then becomes, of the solution, inverted commas, is that our willingness to embrace reality as best we can understand and see it. So the method that I often talk about is, and you were doing a wonderful meditation this morning, and is that in meditations and guided meditations like that, what we would put in is to imagine one's own death, or to imagine the death of someone we love. Okay. So that when it comes up, the experience is already a familiar one. Okay. And we have begun to understand that it is inevitable, and then we have already understood the framework about the inevitability of death. Okay. And the same thing with dukkha or dissatisfaction. Of course, dissatisfaction also includes the whole idea of suffering. So it is, we can prepare ourselves, and that is where the method element is so extremely important for this.
When you say method element, you're referring to training the mind
I'm talking about training the mind, exactly. With some of the practices that you were doing. Of course, in our tradition, we work almost entirely with antidotes rather than with actual experiences.
What do you mean by an antidote?
So an antidote is, again, the universal antidote is, it's, again, this example, if you have an ulcer, you take an antacid. So the antacid is an antidote to the ulcer because it sort of dilutes whatever it is. So rather than trying to treat the ulcer by going in and doing surgery or so, something dramatic, so for us the universal antidote is compassion.
So this example of death that you just take, if we took that forward, the antidote to that would be to actually meditate and visualize that.
See, death is a very, very inherent important part. It may not be the best example, but since it is the most extreme for many of us.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us struggle with it.
So meditation on death is a very intrinsic and important part of our practice. Okay. So on most days, I mean, I have to be honest, and there are some days I'm recalcitrant and don't quite make it happen with the intensity and concentration that it should, but I try and sit every day for, whatever, 30, 40 minutes. But sometimes the mind is distracted and fuzzy. But on the days that it isn't, then one of the important techniques is to visualize death. Because we use meditation on death as an instrument to look at both impermanence, that everything will sometime,
pass,
and change. So meditation on that gives us a context to look at both the pillars that I often talk about impermanence, and change, and not so much interdependence, but also interdependence. So these three pillars, come up on meditation on death. And then death, of course, ends up being not just physical death, but change, the impermanence of a relationship. Is also impermanent. So you can look at the death of a relationship. So it's not just physical death where the consciousness leaves the body.
So Rajiv, I want to ask you that when you are actually observing this, you're receiving the meditation, are you also told what your emotional responses are meant to be, or that is like a clearance to move you away from anxiety?
No, it's, you see, you meditate because you meditate.
Okay.
Because the problem arises that when we set ourselves a yardstick and say, if you meditate, this is what's going to happen to you.
Right.
Then we immediately have a tangible, concrete measure where we put in a label, success or failure. So you can never fail in meditation, because the very fact of meditation is a part of your evolution and growth, and there'll be good days and bad days, there'll be successes and failures, and that is life.
Okay.
So just like in mindfulness meditation, and incidentally in our tradition, we don't really emphasize mindfulness much. We just see it as a very important but relatively minor aspect of meditation practice. It's precisely because of this that we have gotten so conditioned and so transactional about meditation. Particularly when you're paying to receive meditation instruction, we are looking at payback from every 5 minutes that we spend on anything. And I think what is inherent in this is patience and process and the unpredictability of how it will happen. Now, having said that, if you have been engaging in a certain practice for 3 years, 5 years, it's very personal.
Yes.
And this is where the teacher plays a very seminal role. And there is this wonderful phrase along with spiritual materialism, which is called spiritual tourism. So we try something and it doesn't work, it doesn't deliver results, we move on to something else. Now, if you wanted to be a great golf player or whatever, I mean, we were just on faith. We would just keep practicing till we made it.
True.
But when it comes to the mind, we have no patience. We want an instant response and instant gratification. So part of the process builds into it the nurturing of patience and the nurturing of what comes up for you, regardless of the label of good, bad, or indifferent that we attach to it. So that training is really comprehensive, but it just means accepting, but not evaluating, because then judgment comes in, and we say, this is good.
Right.
But no experience is good or bad, per se. It is when we create we create an experience out of volition, then it is the motivation that determines whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. Was our intention larger than ourselves?
Right.
And that doesn't mean that if someone is beating us up, we just sort of allow ourselves to be beaten up, because we need to survive to carry on being good or virtuous or whatever.
Right.
And anyway, I could go on. Too much.
Yeah, but I mean, it just brought me back to what you mentioned yesterday, that despite the Tibetan occupation by China, you still have the Tibetan monks praying for the Chinese.
It's not just occupation, it's genocide. It's the destruction of their culture, of their faith, where you had extreme situations where monks made to fornicate with nuns in public.
Oh, no.
Where they put where the stones from the money stones from their monasteries were put on urinal walls. So it was not just a decimation of a people physically, but an assault on the very basis of their sensibilities. And so His Holiness, I think I mentioned this yesterday, I don't remember, often recounts there was a Dr. Tenzin Chodak, who I had the privilege of meeting, who was the Dalai Lama's personal physician, who was in a Chinese gulag for 30 years, and when he finally came out, and such a happy man. And so His Holiness said, "What was the most difficult time?" He said, "The most challenging time for me was that when at one time I experienced hatred and hostility to the Chinese who was torturing me." So that's an extreme. I mean, that's not something I would dream of arriving at in the next 1,000 lifetimes.
Yeah.
But it illustrates that how we can change our experience of suffering. It's not easy, but the same thing happened. You had Elie Wiesel was this famous Jewish philosopher and activist. I mean, he came out of the Nazi persecution concentration camps with a very large, inclusive vision. And there were people who came out with great bitterness, who felt that they had to, catch, identify, and make sure, revenge, that, 50 years later, a 110-year-old tottering man on the hospital bed had to be convicted and given capital punishment. There were two completely different responses. Now, I would argue that it was Elie Wiesel who had a much happier post-concentration camp life than the people who were seeking that kind of justice.
True. So I just want to come to this concept of ahimsa, which Buddhism talks about. And the Dalai Lama speaks that personal transformation, it's not enough to just look at your own well-being. What's really important is also focusing on the welfare of others around you, right? And that was interesting that on his 73rd birthday, he said that focus on actually reaching out to the community where you can surrender your personal sense of self, which I find quite fascinating, because we're talking about the self here, we're talking about discovering our own identity. And here he says that for your transformation to really be deep, you need to actually let go of your sense of self. Could you tell us something about that?
Well, it really, what he's talking about is compassion.
Okay.
And compassion means to, think about the other. And when I say think about the other while remaining yourself competent and able to continue to think about the other. So it does not mean a level of, a sort of abject surrender or giving up so that you become dysfunctional and you collapse.
Okay.
So we have the idea in Buddhism of the middle path
Right.
of balance. And this derives very much, His Holiness is very inspired by Gandhi, who talked about need and greed. So there is enough for our needs,
Not enough
but not
for our
our
greed.
greeds.
Yeah.
And when he's talking about reaching out to other people and seeing what you can do to make their lives happier and more comfortable, is being wisely selfish. Because in the process of doing so, not only are you making a difference to other people's lives, but you're making a difference to your own life. And that's a very crucial principle that comes in there. And so this then brings in this idea of love. And so I love somebody, but then and that's why we prefer compassion to love, because love it is that in many of these phrases that we use, there is a lot of semantic baggage.
And it's become transactional.
Yes, so semantic baggage with love is reciprocity, is attachment, is XYZ.
Expectation.
Expectation. So I'm sure that over a period of time, we'll have to look for another word beyond compassion when that develops its own baggage.
Right.
And so to being, outer directed is also is wise. Because then the sense, we don't say elimination of the self, because we need a certain sense of self to be to remain functional. So we rather say the softening of the self rather than the elimination of self. Though, mind you, that in the idea of the Buddhist self is very often, I think, mistakenly translated into English as no self. So what we're talking about, that shunya.
Shunya.
So
emptiness is a very important concept.
Yes,
also.
but this is a classic example of where, and certainly because Tibetan Buddhism has only recently found expression and articulation in the West, that we are victims of the inadequacy of language. So when we say that shunya means emptiness, what we really mean is exactly what I've been talking about, that shunya means that it is empty of inherent existence, which means that nothing has an independent existence.
Right.
So we prefer to say that, nothing independently exists, rather to say shunya. Because again, the idea is that all these have a certain in inverted commas usefulness. So when we want to talk about the emptiness of inherent existence or shunya, it is also that it helps us diminish our attachment to objects, people, places, and things. Because when we begin to see things as impermanent, that the woman I love or the object that I crave is impermanent, it's going to keep changing. It softens my attachment to that person or phenomena.
Right.
And hence we use this idea of shunya. And shunya is the authentic word, but it does not mean emptiness. Okay. It does not mean nothingness. Because again, if something is empty, then there is nothing there. It's
okay. These are complex concepts, which
I only partially understand. It's very easy to talk about, and ultimately you have to experience the reality of it for it to substantially impact who you are. And what's really reassuring is that His Holiness, if you asked the Dalai Lama, as I mentioned, I think yesterday, he still does 4, 5, 6, 5 hours, maybe it's come down post-COVID, he's 87 years old, is that he hasn't got it all. I mean, he would never claim that he's enlightened. He would not admit that he's the Bodhisattva. And he'd just say he's an aspirant, like at different levels.
Right.
And he is still aspirant, he's practicing, and every Bodhisattva continues to practice. Even the Buddha continued to engage in practices after he attained enlightenment. In fact, the poor man, after he sat under the Bodhi tree and emerged, he was utterly confused. because he didn't know how to communicate
What he had just
to what he had just experienced. And he hesitated, and then he said, and that's where the method became so important. So he said, I cannot explain to people what I have been through, so all I can do is I can share the method that will enable them to experience it too.
What I have, okay.
And nor did the Buddha or any of the heirs of the Buddha make the claim that I will touch you and I will somehow lead you to light without you making the effort.
So Raji, before we get into the Q&A, one very quick question. So the self that all of us are searching for, we say myself, right? This self, I mean, so is it a fixed state of being, or is it a constantly evolving, dynamic state? How would you define the self then? We're searching for the self.
Well, I think we're mistakenly searching for the self. That's the problem.
Okay.
We can't find it.
Is it something that you cannot find?
Well, I mean, if you were to be honest and you keep reflecting and you say, where is the I? I mean, where does the I exist? We normally grasp for our heart or whatever it is, we give it a physiological thing. Which interestingly, what I found very remarkable, I was rereading Ramana Maharishi, and Ramana Maharishi said, the Atman, the I in Hinduism, is actually not on the left where the heart, physiological heart is, but on the right.
Okay.
So, I mean, I don't think these are things that you can lock in and concretely define. So through practice and that is where the experience of listening to and engaging with a diversity of perspectives and the diversity of methods and the diversity of people, some of whom I ended up feeling great reverence and respect, some of them revealed to my worldview what I ought not to do or not to become.
Okay.
And the bottom line was a transparent sense of compassion with a diminished sense of self as the ultimate yardstick of the aspiration that I feel I have been groomed to seek.
Beautifully put. Thank you. Do we have time for Q&A?
Can you repeat that, Rajiv, please?
I've forgotten.
She said,
Sense of self.
and compassion, an expanded sense of compassion, if you want. I don't know what.
Remember.
It was compassion and a diminished sense of self. Very beautifully
It's
said.
being recorded.
Yes.
Sir, thank you very much for being here today. My question is about consciousness and how it ties to the soul. My first question is consciousness aware of where your soul is at that moment, number one. And then number two, if we are all interconnected and we don't stand as individuals, but we do have a self, where is that line? Thank you.
Well, I'll tell you quite honestly, the reason I'm not able to give you an honest answer is that in our worldview, we don't have the notion of a soul. Because a soul assumes something substantial that has indefinite continuity. So whether if I have a soul, and the equivalent of that in the Hindu tradition is Atman, and then we believe in the Hindu tradition that, and there are two views again, and as one's reading grows, you begin to see two different perspectives. So one perspective is where the soul merges with Brahman. And so Brahman is the universal, the ultimate reality or whatever energy that you want to call it. And the other view, which someone like Ramana Maharishi teaches us, he's saying, but there's no question of it merging with anything. The Atman is already a part of Brahman. So they're really the same thing. In just two different contexts, we're giving them two different labels. but where we come from, that there is no continuity of a single unitary element called the soul, and which is why when we die, consciousness such as it is, actually consciousness, I don't want to use the word disappears, but only comes into being again when the causes and conditions enable it to come, like ice cream. So when there is this, so consciousness only evolves in that space, time, and context. And in terms of the interdependence, I think we are both autonomous and we are interdependent. So we have a degree of autonomy while being interdependent. So we're not just complete. Otherwise, we could just sit back and surrender and say, look, my life will unfold as everybody else wants it to, or as will entirely and exclusively dependent on everybody else. But in reality, my life also depends on the acts of volition that I am capable of, and the human form is the only form of life where there is volition, no matter what the baggage that you feel you may have been born with.
Rajiv, I want to just take that forward a little bit. When you speak about consciousness disappearing, then where does reincarnation come in?
Exactly.
But you have that with the Dalai Lama.
No, but the
right?
reincarnation comes in just like the ice cream. The causes and conditions are right, and so the consciousness takes form. And what happens is that as the consciousness gets increasingly subtle, and the two aspects that are operating at that time. One is motivation, which means that, and there's a difference between intention and motivation. I may intend to do something which is very unholy and unwholesome, but my motivation should be compassion. So motivation is a little more nuanced in that direction than in intention, as far as English language is concerned. So in the case of the Dalai Lama, there are two elements that are operating. That not only is he being driven by the compassion to take rebirth in order to teach and serve humanity, but by the motivation that this should be in a form and manner that is most useful. And today, so far, the 14 Dalai Lamas, the 13 that have preceded him and the 14th, have been driven by the commitment that manifestation should happen, that in a manner and form that is useful not just to all humanity, but primarily to the Tibetan civilizational heritage. And through that, so today what the Dalai Lama is really saying, and this is 2 minutes of time, because I think this is a very important principle for the present political sort of impasse, in a sense, on the institution of the Dalai Lama and what the future will be. So what Tenzin Gyatso, the monk, who is the Dalai Lama, he says that I, the monk, just a human being, my aspiration is to take, and I will take a rebirth in a form and manner that will be most useful to humanity. Now, if that means that it will be as a woman, a pretty woman, which got him into some trouble, and in which country, depends entirely on where it will be most useful. I will take a call as the situation unfolds, and I will let you guys know before I move on to the heavenly fields. That's my little aside on the heavenly fields, that whether it will be in the form of the institution of the Dalai Lama. And this issue is compounded because we forget that after the monk takes reincarnation as a young boy, there's a gap of about 20 years before he actually assumes responsibility, and 20 years in global politics is a long time. So there is a great risk that in his making that commitment, and then the Chinese choice, and there's 20 years that can go by before he actually manifests. Right. So while he may physically manifest as a child in 2 years or 3 years, what happens during that 17 years? Right. So it's a very complex, nuanced position. And he, as someone who has responded so dynamically to the unfolding realities, including the democratization of his political authority, could well, and this is purely a personal opinion, there's nothing that he has suggested that it will be so, he could well do one of two things. One is that he might appoint somebody as a successor in this life, but what I feel is more likely to happen is that that he may go back to the model of the ancient Buddhist Sangha, which incidentally and interestingly is the model on which the Ramakrishna mission is modeled, which means that completely decentralized, and that they elect. There is a hierarchy. Sorry?
Like the Pope.
Well, the Pope is just elected by the cardinals, but the cardinals are appointed. But in the Ramakrishna mission, that so each mission is fairly autonomous, and they're deeply secular, or they're meant to be. And in fact, they declare themselves not a Hindu but a secular organization. So it probably would go with something like that if he still feels that the institution is important. Now, that's my personal conjecture.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rajiv.